All right, so let's talk about the plight of a group of workers during this COVID-19 period, and this is domestic workers. Domestic workers fall in very many categories, don't they?
Yeah, sure. We look at domestic workers. I think the first thing that comes to your mind is that people who work within a home setting and are able to either take care of your home or take care of children, that kind of thing. All right. So to clamor to have this sector formalized has been in the throes of conversation for a very long time, and to look at in terms of what they're entitled to when it comes to wages and also protections for things like future pensions and health and other matters. Now, looking at COVID times, this was one sector that was highly affected because of the fact that many people then were at home, and then they had to cut back on their expenses because of what COVID offered in terms of job cuts and losses and reductions in salary. This was actually one of the sectors to have been affected quite highly that maybe we didn't really pay attention to, because guess what? They're at home and they're behind closed doors most often, and you don't really speak about them until you have an issue, maybe with your children or things like that. But they were affected highly because parents then were at home, either because they lost their job or they were working from home. And so the need to then have somebody at home then was eliminated, and they had to go home. So they either lost their jobs, those who came on a daily basis, then maybe it was reduced, so they were asked to maybe come a couple of times a week, or others then told to leave completely.
Yep.
And they faced a particular plight that really was not truly addressed. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, because on the same day that we talk about this, we've also seen a ruling in the Labor and Employment Court then when it comes to their protections and what needs to be done when either terminating their work or their payment or things like this. So we're going to be joined today on the line with a program manager from the Kenya Human Rights Commission, and that is Mary Kambo. And also we're going to be joined by an activist when it comes to domestic workers and their rights, and that's Ruth Mumbi. And they're with us this morning to have this conversation and look at what it really means, how we've come to the place where we are now on different levels, as we look at that. The big issues here that we're talking about, because once you think about it, everybody needs at some point somebody to be in their home and help out with that work. So if we can just start off and get into that conversation this morning and really then what it means. And I guess both of you ladies, welcome to the show this morning, Ruth and Mary.
Thank you very much, Ndu, for having us.
Thank you too for having us.
Karibuni very much, ladies, to the Situation Room. So we want to talk about the plight and the rights of domestic workers. Ruth Mumbi, you are a domestic workers activist. What is it that you advocate on behalf of domestic workers?
Okay, I'm a human rights activist, and I'm working with a group of domestic workers in Mathare, Korogosho, and Kariobangi. And as a human rights activist and a defender, my main work is to educate these women to understand the rights that they hold, and also to defend them when they become vulnerable of abuse, mostly perpetrated by their employers, and hold their hands to show how they can access justice. And basically my work has been linking these women with organizations that can help them have access to justice, and also enlightening them to understand the rights that they have.
It sounds like, a lot of things that happen all at the same time. But in terms of, accessing justice, in terms of knowing their rights, just borrowing from what we are seeing in today's paper, Made in Heaven is the headline on the Standard page 3. House helps cannot be fired without notice. The rights of house helps, just as a summary here, is that you're supposed to pay them the minimum salary of 10,107 shillings plus NSSF and NHIF. Give them 1 month notice before terminating employment, or pay a 1 month salary in lieu of notice. If you terminate employment, you must give them a certificate of service and terminal benefits. They should not work on public holidays and weekends, and they are entitled to a 1 month leave in a year. This sounds like proper formalization of this sector, which has for a long time been considered, one of those very, very informal sectors. Mary.
Yes. Yeah, that's correct. So you find that we have laws, and the employment laws in Kenya do not actually distinguish between a domestic worker and any other worker. So we do not have special laws, for instance, for domestic workers. That is to say that those rights that you have articulated for domestic workers are rights that accrue to any other worker.
Yep.
Now, that is where I find the biggest challenge, because the circumstances of domestic workers are completely unique. They are completely different from your circumstance, who is in a white-collar job, and so they therefore require some sort of special protection in law, if you ask me, because bundling them together with everybody in law has meant that the uniqueness of their sector has not been completely recognized and appreciated by the law, and that is why they are subjected to the violations and the vulnerabilities that we see every day.
Could you please point out some of these unique features that you speak of?
Yeah, one of those features is the fact that these workers work behind closed doors. They're isolated from everybody else. So that makes their working environment and condition very removed from the rest of us. So what happens
I don't get
to a
that.
domestic worker? Oh, you don't get that?
Yeah, they're working in my house. How are they isolated from everybody else in my house?
They're not isolated from people in your house. They're isolated from the rest of the workers. I'll give you an example. So, for instance, an organization like where I work employs whatever number of workers, say 2 or 3. So we all have a common employer. If we were to advance a cause, it would be very easy to mobilize each other. But look at a domestic worker who is a sole employee to a single employer, and therefore if they have an issue, they are working in a private premise. They're isolated from the rest of the community. The only time you know what a domestic worker goes through is when they go to a shop and they happen to just tell the shopkeeper that, by the way, huyu mama ananitesa. But before that, nobody else gets to see it apart from you, the employer, and your family. That is a very unique employment relationship, and it requires a particular special regulation, if you ask me. It requires a law that allows penetration into private homes, because a labor officer today coming to my home, I will tell them you're trespassing. This is a private home. So we require a law that enables that protection can actually be at the very place where they work, which is very, very isolated and removed from the rest of the society.
How did things change? I mean, if I can ask you, Ruth, how did things change with COVID? If we're looking at, and the complaints have come out that enter into the society COVID, and then the work space for a lot of these domestic workers has changed. What changed here?
If there is a group of people that has been highly affected by COVID-19, is the domestic workers. And as Mary pointed out, I work with a very unique set group of domestic workers. These are workers who are not formally employed, but they usually go on a daily basis to their employer houses and do a casual job. So, in fact, with the legislation that you people are talking about, in many instances, the group that I do represent is not categorized in those policies that has been formulated. When COVID-19 hit Kenya, these women were highly affected. because majority of them go to Eastleigh to find work and get a living from Eastleigh. And as you are aware, there was a time shortly after COVID-19, Eastleigh was under lockdown. So not everybody could access. In fact, people couldn't even access Eastleigh. And this is a space or a place where these women were going to get their livelihood. So what it meant that these women could not even afford basic need as food, because they work on a daily basis and they are paid on a daily basis after work. And so for them, they lost livelihood. They could not be able to afford even to give and feed for their family. And through that, some have even tried to survive the pandemic. They have come with adaptive measures, and some even started selling groceries and vegetables. And then the same government later decided that even grocery sellers,
they're spreading the virus as well.
Yes.
Wanasambaza.
They're sambazing the viruses. So kukakuwa people hawezi nunua hata mboga kwa mama mboga, because you are afraid the way the government has portrayed them ya kwamba hao ndio wanaosambaza virusi.
I don't want to sound unempathetic to what you're raising, because it's an important thing, but if I were to look at the worker in Kenya who derives his livelihood from daily wages, you've just described almost every worker who falls into that category. Because the plight of what you're calling the domestic worker is the same plight that the factory worker had. It's the same plight that the mjengo worker had. It's the same plight that anybody who falls in that sector where you're paid on a daily basis had to endure. So the uniqueness that you speak of may exist, but it's unique to then people who work in this sector, not specifically people who are domestic workers.
But they are domestic workers. They go to places like Kisili, go to Buruburu, go to Pangani to wash clothes and wash houses. But they are not protected by the law.
What kind of protections would we be seeking from the law then, or by the law? And maybe Mary can come into this. What kinds of things are you seeking to say that they would be protected? In any case, they're dealing on a day-to-day basis. It's not guaranteed that you would have employment every day. So if they were to be protected by the law, what is it that we would be looking at?
All right. Actually, before I just delve into that, just to answer, not Eric, that was Citi.
Yep.
Yes, Citi asked the question of, again, uniqueness. Now, I just want to take you back to your employment setup where you were able to organize with other workers. Look at it that way, that this is a worker who is working in a private home, as I said, and therefore even organizing is completely curtailed. And the right to organize is extremely fundamental for a worker, because it's the right on which these other rights are premised. It's the right that allows you to come today and say, can you give me a pay rise? Because you have been able to organize. And organizing gives you an effect of power. So that power is deroded of domestic workers because, again, they are just working in solitude. But now, coming to the question of what protections we would be looking for. So, because the informal sector, especially for domestic work, because there are two categories of domestic workers. So when we talk about domestic workers, we also need to have that clarity. We have the live-in domestic workers and the live-outs. So the live-outs are the ones who are coming every day and then going back to their homes. These ones actually are more vulnerable, and these ones are the ones that Ruth has particularly talked about, where, I mean, they come and work and go home. So these particular ones would require protection around so many things, because we have had many of them talking about sexual harassment, and many are not even able to report. Remember that when they are informal domestic workers who report to you every day, many of them are not given contracts. Many of them are just casual employees. I talked to some, and they were telling me, I have worked for this one employer for 13 years. They have nothing to show for that employment relationship. So the first key protection is that they must be given contracts, whether they are informal or live-in, because without a contract, it becomes very difficult to point to so many other rights and obligations of the employer. But of course, we have seen the courts have been very progressive, and they have pronounced themselves that even a verbal contract will be recognized in the face of the law. But you see, it gives the domestic worker a lot of time to prove, because the burden of proof lies with he who alleges.
Yep.
Exactly. So
But
it becomes difficult.
I get
Yeah.
the impression that the domestic worker you're referring to is somebody who goes to seek work in a premise where perhaps the owner of that premise or the household is not known to them. But historically, if you look at many communities in this country, what we now define as a domestic worker was often a relative,
Correct.
often a younger relative, and the understanding with the parents of this younger relative was that apart from them helping with the younger children that you had, you were supposed to provide some education, some training, etc., etc. Where does this category of individual fit into this scheme that you talk of?
You see exactly where the problem is, CT, because when traditionally relatives, younger relatives were brought in to work in homes, most of them were, as you have put it, younger relatives. So the sector of domestic work actually perpetuated child labor for a very long time. And you will still see relatives who bring in younger relatives. Most of these are children who ought to be in school. Yes, it's difficult in the rural area. They were not going to school in the first place. But removing them from an opportunity to ever access education is completely unlawful. So that is the traditional notion and how it evolved. But today, we have the live-in domestic workers. Again, a large percentage do not have contracts. Many of them are paid below the minimum wage, which you have quoted this morning. They work very long hours. The day many start the day at 4 a.m., 5 a.m. They have to get children ready for school. Well, schools are closed right now, but I can actually tell you the ones that are living in are confirming the workload
is still the same.
Double what
actually, yes,
it has
it's double
increased.
because the children are at home. It sounds to
Exactly.
me, Mary and Ruth, like we're talking about formalizing this sector, but then shifting the burden of formalizing the sector not to the people who are, members of the sector, but to their employers. And I think the conversation then should be had with the members of this sector to formalize themselves. Already there's a union that deals with this. KUDEIHA, the Kenya Union of Domestic, Hotel, and was it?
Education,
Education
institutions.
And institutions. That is already a union that the members of this profession can fit into. But also formalization is where we have seen several other companies that come up where if I'd like to have a domestic worker in my home, I actually am contracting this company to provide the service, and they are the ones that send this. We have seen that evolution happening in the security sector, where now we are no longer employing individual guards, but increasingly people are actually getting into contracts with companies, and then those companies are the ones that are employing the guards who will be deployed to your home. This was not a movement that was initiated by the people who were seeking the services of guards. It was the guards who came up with that scheme themselves. So how can the domestic workers then formalize their own industry?
Now, that's where actually the answer to their dilemma lies. Because organizing will resolve the question I talked about, that it's the fundamental right workers need to come together. When you come together, you have a sense of power because you speak in one voice and there are many of you. So even targeting you becomes difficult for the employer. So the challenge that domestic workers have had in terms of coming together and organizing themselves is the removedness. And remember, most of them work Monday to Sunday, Sunday to Sunday. Many of them are not given a day off. So even Kudeha, the union that mobilizes and has been able to organize quite a huge following of domestic workers, will tell you one of the biggest challenges they face is that many of them are not given off days, and therefore it becomes difficult. So until we first begin by enforcing the law, let them rest on Sunday, let them rest on Saturday. It's one day in a week, whichever day it will be. Let them rest. That gives them an opportunity to go out there, to meet in Uhuru Park, meet other workers, and start a movement of domestic workers until we enforce the law to allow them to converge out there, to also allow them to access information. Many of them do not know the law that we are citing today. They do not know the minimum wage. They do not know they have a right to a rest day once in a week. They do not know that. So it has to begin with the policymakers, the government, coming right to enforce the law so that domestic workers understand there's a law that actually protects them and that they can now begin to even organize. Yes, Eric.
Where is the role of we've seen the proliferation of domestic workers bureaus and agents, because many of the people who are employing domestic workers today, if you ask them, where did you get this person from, they'll tell you, I went to a certain bureau, which is where the people who are employed as domestic workers already know, if I'm seeking work, I'll go to a certain bureau, I'll register myself, people will come and interview me there, and I will be taken home. So what's the role of these bureaus in capacity building, even for the domestic workers, or even the formalization of the industry?
No, I think they would play a critical role. Unfortunately, most of them are not. Most of them are not formed within the ambit of the law. Most of them are very random kiosks that spring up in estate every morning. And in my own analysis, the bureaus have been a major conduit for exploitation of domestic workers. In many instances, when an employer comes to a bureau to pick a domestic worker, and then get directly negotiate.
We are having a conversation about the plight of domestic workers, especially during this COVID-19 period. And on the line with us this morning is Ruth Mombi. She is a domestic workers activist, and Mary Kambo. She is a program manager at the Kenya Human Rights Commission. We were talking about, formalization of this. We're talking about the government coming up with policies that specifically protect the rights of the domestic workers. CT?
Well, the question that has been sort of like swelling in my mind is, even as we fight for the rights of the domestic worker, do we actually have a movement that guarantees that anyone who qualifies under that banner is actually known? Meaning, do we have the numbers? Is there membership? What would be required? Because if you're talking about enforcing certain laws, certain things must come into play. You must know how many of these people exist who fall in that category. You must also know, for instance, that other things will come in. There'll be a demand and there'll be a request to understand, okay, fine. What sort of training must a domestic worker then have to be considered? Will they require certification? And we talk about workman's compensation for people who work in the workplace in this country. All these things that other workers take for granted or is taken for granted on behalf of the other workers will have to apply, but then they have to be known.
So who'd gather these statistics and this information?
I am talking to the people
To the activists.
who are championing the cause of this worthy cause. Let me preface and say worthy cause of the domestic worker.
Ruth Mombi, have you done any of this groundwork, like, collating information and knowing how many people that you're talking about who work in this sector and so on and so forth?
Yes, we've been trying to bring these women together. And as I had said earlier, we I usually work with women who are based in Italy, and majority come from Mathare, and we've tried to create a platform where we can bring them together to sensitize them to understand the rights that they hold. But also the difficulty or the challenge usually comes in because majority, for you to bring them in, you need some sort of facilitation, and you can't like bring women together and keeping them in whole day without even facilitating them, and they are supposed to go out and work so that they can get food for their families. But we have tried what we can as community organizers within Mathare and Korogosho to try and bring these women together to understand. And what we've realized, the majority of these women are women of middle age and young women. And majority also are not educated, they are school dropouts. And I think through that, because of age and also educational background, that becomes a vulnerability towards them in terms of which makes them to be more vulnerable to abuse by the employer or people who give them work. And for us, basically, we have been trying to bring in partners, civil society organizations that has capacity to help us try and organize them so that they can have, because in future we want to see them more organized to have an outfit or an organization that can help them in terms of also, you know, when you are more organized, you have more power in terms of even bargaining with your employers.
That's very true, Ruth. But so far, when you say majority have this, majority lack education, how many are you talking about? How many have you been able to bring together or even list in the areas that you've worked in, the Korogosho and Isli?
Like over 600 are school dropouts, and when I'm saying a school dropout, majority are class 8 dropouts. Well, at least on the Somasana, it's Form 2. Form 2. They couldn't even afford to pay for their school fees. So the alternative that they had is going to venturing into domestic work.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if there's been a clamor for formalization for this sector for a very long time, and it started, you know, when we saw now it taking shape is when we looked at the minimum wage, which went across board. So minimum wage, that just in case we need to look at that, it stood at this 10,000 shillings across board for you know employees, not just domestic staff. This was the minimum wage for the country. Now, we're looking at a sector also, and this is for both of you, Ruth and Mary. We're looking at a sector that is hired by people who have a little bit more in their pockets and people who don't. Even the people who earn very little then have to hire domestic workers to essentially take care of their children. Does a minimum wage like this, since we're talking about formalization of the sector, then even make sense for the people who earn even less than this amount but still need a domestic worker in their employ? I guess we can start off with Mary.
Thank you, Ndu, for that question. I think really that's a very good question, very interesting question, because and I want to correct that minimum wage that is provided by the newspaper. The minimum wage for domestic workers right now is slightly over 13,000 shillings, because they have had increments over May Day, Labor Day. So it should be slightly over 13,000 shillings. And this is a huge wage, for example, actually comparing to a flower farm worker whose minimum wage is exactly half that amount. The minimum wage for flower farm workers, for example, is 6,700 or thereabouts. That means a flower farm worker, as you have correctly put it, who requires the services of a domestic worker is not able to afford them.
No.
So there is actually need to harmonize the entire labor sector, because it is completely appalling. It's shocking that a worker at 6,000 will need the services of a domestic worker who is at twice their minimum wage. That is a dilemma. It's a big dilemma, and it lies squarely with the policymakers. This is the Ministry of Labor that ought to actually harmonize the wages. The problem is our wages are very colonial. When you talk about 6,700, this is a very low wage, and it is because people were working in farms, colonial farms, and were paid peanuts for that. So we have
Actually, that is not
revision.
the complete picture. Because when you say colonial, one of the things that workers in farms did, they were housed.
Yes.
There was a
They were
certain...
given food.
Yes, there were considerations.
Yes.
And that thinking is what has followed even with the domestic worker, because there's the thinking that if it's a live-in domestic worker, they have housing and they also eat. So
They have food.
these are realities of that sort of employment. Yes.
And
It's
so
very
even
true.
because this is the argument that has been brought about many people when these conversations began, and even for you, Ruth, to say that, because you said now if it's a minimum wage of 13,000+ shillings and this individual lives in your home, partakes of the things that you would give to your children as well. So they use electricity, water, the food that you eat is the same food that they eat. So quite a number of their expenses have been taken care of. Are these things then taken into consideration when there's this agitation for formalization, when it even comes to how much a domestic worker is paid, Ruth?
I think I can leave it to Mary to answer that, because he's in the legal.
No, it's really an interesting question, and it's a difficult question. I'm not even sure I would have the answer to that. But you see, it's the question of saying that there is a need to review the wages, so that, for instance, I have been in forums where the ministry has defended that wage and said, whether you provide food or not, whether they are living in your house or live out domestic workers, this is the wage as agreed by the Ministry of Labor. So it's really a question of harmonizing, because as long as it is not realistic to pay one 6,000 and another 13, and yet the two will depend on each other for services, then there is need to review. And it is not even to lower. I'm not saying it should be lowered. It is that the wages for these other people who need these services should be realistically raised. For instance, I've given the example of flower farm workers at barely below 7,000. So it's really a review of these wages. Yeah.
Well, also, there's the burden that seems to be shifted to the employer. Remember, we're talking about domestic. So this is not a formal organization like a flower farm that is a business that's running a business. This is you running your home. And then here comes the law and tells you that you are supposed to pay this person this much. You're supposed to give them this kind of benefit. And also, it is your responsibility to remit NHIF, NSSF on their behalf. Surely. Where does the law come in and start, giving you added responsibility when you're basically just trying to run your own home?
You're running your own home, but you are an employer in every sense of that word. You have brought yourself in the way of the employment because you have decided, I'm running my family and I need the service of another person to enable me run my family. That makes you an automatic employer. So that now shifts the burden to you to also negotiate with your employer to be able to afford the services of a domestic worker. Because, you see, Eric, your rights end where mine begin. So you're running your own family. You have a right to run a family. You have a right to your own premise and everything. But once I come into that space, my rights begin right at that place. That I have a right to earn a wage. It is 13,000.
Yeah.
I have a right actually that I can go for 3 months of paid maternity leave and still come back to that employment. And they do not get these rights. They do not enjoy. They do not get to enjoy. But these rights are there. So it's really it's a catch-22.
I
And
hear
think
you. I hear you. And, you know, logically and legally, you make a lot of sense. Practically, this is where
Yeah.
the issues come in, which brings me back to what, ladies, I'm really trying to advocate here.
struggling with.
Formalization of the domestic workers sector needs to be pushed further and more by advocates such as yourselves and the people who work in this sector. For example, all these things that I'm raising, if there was a company that I had contracted, I'd be remitting my money to that company, and the company is responsible because the company is the employer of this particular lady. This company is the one that is dealing with all the HR issues. As far as I'm concerned, it's I've outsourced this service to this particular company. I think that would, you know, bridge this whole gap that we have. The company would know. So if worker so and so is taking leave, then my contract with this with Eric still stands, and I'm gonna be able to provide somebody else to come and continue providing that service to Eric when the worker who's been working in Eric's home goes. Why don't we see more of this push towards formalization and formation of companies that then employ the domestic workers?
You raise a critical point, Eric, and I completely agree with you. But I would also remind you that those very companies have been conduits for exploitation. You're talking about security guards, organized, and therefore an organization like ours will outsource the services of a guard from a security company. We will not directly engage a security worker. I tell you what happens when you pay that security company, the security company ends up undercutting the guard. Very few of them are earning the minimum wage again, and most of the organizations that contract their services are paying the minimum wage, but the company again ends up undercutting. So it becomes a broad conversation around.
But there's a solution.
Vigilance.
It's easier to get a solution with that because now you'd be dealing with a company.
Directly.
As journalists, I could come and work for the Standard Group directly, or just come to the studio and broadcast. But because I'm employed by the Standard Group, if there are issues of how the Standard Group treats its workers, it's easier to deal with the Standard Group and how it treats its workers.
That's very correct.
As opposed
That's very correct.
So for me, this is still a solution.
But I want to take your mind away from what we're calling a problem and consider yet another problem. It's an issue of supply and demand. So long as you have more people looking for livelihood, not even earning a fair wage, then it means that those who provide that employment have an advantage, an unfair advantage of paying whatever they like. And the person who's looking for that job will accept it because the alternative is infinitely more dismal than that. So the question that perhaps we should think of addressing, when you mentioned the government, I agree with you fully, is how do you protect the unemployed? Because the domestic worker falls into the category of the unemployed, and their unique situation, of course, requires unique attention. But we have more people looking for those same jobs than there are jobs available.
Can you allow me to come in?
Yes,
Because, I think Eric's proposal, and I'm talking from a point of experience, it's very problematic. Having companies for these domestic workers to register, for me, I think it's very problematic.
What were known as bureaus, right?
Yes, it's very problematic because they have been also they have become agency of exploitation. They exploit. In fact, they are more exploitative for our domestic workers more than even the employers. And we have seen even with these domestic workers who have been ferried to Arab countries, how these agencies are treating them, how they are even, milking them. And, so for me, I don't think whether that's a solution.
But you see, Ruth, the agencies, as you're looking at them, those are like employment agencies. I am talking about a company. Go to a certain security company, and that is the company that has employed this person. The agency is basically just linking you with the employer.
But I'm also I'm afraid that it can for that company to turn out to be like an agency, because you're dealing with people who are not even have a proper education. How guaranteed are we that they are going to protect even them? Why can't we empower these domestic workers to push their agenda with
But
organization?
you have a valid point. You should push the agenda, but it may not seem like it makes sense, but it's been proven that collective bargaining, getting your resources together, works better for the worker. That's why you have unions. It's something that has been tested and proved. Yes, there are unscrupulous people who will want to exploit them, absolutely. But believe me, the exploitation is reduced significantly when they are actually formally in a group. The training is essential, because every time you talk about formalizing or grouping people, training always comes in. And you are right, they should be trained. But they will make a stronger point for their case if they are a group, not as individuals.
I think we're mixing issues here, Eric and City, because we're talking about organizing in the form of a company, and we have given the picture of what this company would look like. The way we source the services of security guards, we understand that picture. But City now introduces the issue of the union. Those two are different outfits. And the mandates will be completely different.
The union was an example. No, I wasn't.
There are different outfits, but also it also makes it easier for a union to deal with one company, as opposed to a union doing collective bargaining agreements with separate employers.
Right.
That's very correct. That's very correct. But remember, for me, I agree with the question of organizing. Okay. Organizing in whatever form. For me, I am a strong proponent of that, because, as I began by saying, there is no stronger force you can have than in the power of coming together. It gives you a lot of force. So that is important, but it cannot overlook, or it should not overlook, the challenges that we have seen. I've just given you an example. A company contracting the services of a guard through a company pays well over 20,000. Most of those guards are really underpaid. So the question of vigilance on enforcement of the law, and also really allowing workers the right to negotiate, the right to participate in decisions that affect their lives directly is very key, so that it's not eroded or taken away by the company. In fact, when I got cut off, I was talking about the employment bureaus, because that question had cropped up, and I had said the employment bureaus would be quite ideal, but unfortunately, the motive and intention of running employment bureaus is quite different. And I was giving an example of where domestic workers do not have a direct negotiation at the point of bargaining. It is the company, it is the employment bureau that negotiates on behalf of the worker. Once they go to the employment space, they find that the expectations are really, really, washed away. So it's important that you must be given that right as a worker, really.
I'd be curious to know how this would be set up, because, kind of like what Siti alluded to earlier, is that you have quite a broad spectrum of individuals who are ready to take whatever is going to come their way. So even in any kind of agitation, they wouldn't necessarily want to go through the bothersome process of now starting to, join voices with other people and this, that, the other thing, because there's some people who are ready to snatch up work if it came. So how would something like this even begin? Would it be one individual who would now start, mushrooming support as they went along? How would something like this come together, apart from what maybe a labor and employment court were to come up with for individuals? How would this come together?
I believe the union is a critical space for organizing, and why the union becomes, a strong base for workers organizing. It is because it is recognized by the law. If you look at the Constitution, Article 41, it provides for the right to organize. So the union then becomes the first entry point and the very fundamental basis for workers to come together and organize. So that's critical. But for instance, I'll give you the example of the union that we have for domestic worker, which is nearly the sole union that's representing this cadre of employees. It's quite wide. I mean, it's talking about hospitals, educational institutions.
Yeah,
it's
very
covering
many.
quite a wide array of,
Right.
which I particularly find problematic.
But
Because-
nothing stops any of these cadres from actually forming another union that serves their interests.
Very true, very true.
You know, we have to
I want
start
to bring
somewhere.
in someone who's
Yes.
called in on the line. This is Triza Kimani. Triza is from the Nani Employee Leasing Company. Triza is listening in, and she's basically just felt she needs to call in and contribute to this. Good morning, Triza.
Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Situation Room. Triza, do you work for the employee leasing company, or do you run an employee leasing company?
We do labor outsourcing called Nani Employee Leasing Company. We've been running this company for the last 11 years. I took this space to be able to structure domestic work. And I must start by saying that it is very unfortunate that we discuss domestic work, looking at it like a victim vis-a-vis an employer. And just that attitude of looking these workers, if a worker is always a victim, makes it very difficult. I think we need to look at domestic work as any other work that contributes to the economy of this country, and also look at it in terms of the person employing has equal rights to the person who is being employed. I think we have focused so much on how bad employers are, and left no responsibility to that particular worker. So as an organization, we've structured it in such a way that we ensure that the worker also takes the responsibility as much as we require the same responsibility from the employer. So if it comes to issues of work, is there the expectations? You're supposed to do 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
And then the employer is supposed to provide you 1, 2, 3. So what we do, we usually give, first of all, give the soft skills to the workers. We tell them what is expected of them as they go to work. At the same time, we're able to work with our client and then discuss what they expected to give the worker. So this way you find that the employer feels if the worker does not meet this expectation, the company will also listen to me. At the same time, the employee feels that if the employer is not fair, I will also be listened to. I've heard Mary talking about that companies exploit. One of the things that we do as a company, our salaries are very open. We discuss with our client how much they want that worker to be paid, taking into consideration the minimum wage.
Okay.
So there is nothing that we are hiding in terms of what the worker is supposed to be paid. We only add our fee to be able to function, to take that human resource function for both parties. Then you are able to make sure that the statutories are given.
Yeah.
We are able to pay for them in SSF. We are able to pay for them in HIF. We are able to plan for their leave. Okay? So this way you find that the employer feels that the worker is responsible as much as
and
they
it's
are also
formalized.
supposed to be responsible. Exactly.
We want to say goodbye to our audience on KTN Home that's been tuned in from 7 o'clock. Just a quick break, and then we come back and conclude this conversation. We are talking about the plight of domestic workers, especially in this COVID-19 times and even before. And we are seeing a ruling that came out of the court yesterday. Households cannot be fired without notice. You've got to give them a month's notice. You've got to give them at least pay minimum wage. You've got to ensure that they are able to take leave. And all the rights of you as an employee elsewhere are the same rights that are entitled to this employee of yours in your own home. We still have on the line with us Ruth Mombi. She's a domestic workers activist and a program manager at the Kenya Human Rights Commission, Mary Kambo. And also joining us on the line is Teresa Kimani, who runs an employee leasing company. And Teresa, you've just given us a background of what, for example, your company is able to do. Let's give the ladies an opportunity to respond to this. Mary, when you hear what Teresa says as a personal experience of what they've been able to do for domestic workers, what do you say to that?
I think I would appreciate the work that Teresa is doing, because she is organizing workers, domestic workers, and enabling them, a platform where they can negotiate for better conditions of employment, better than what we have seen ordinarily. So she's doing a brilliant job. But I think it's really important to add, where Teresa talks about us always looking at domestic workers as victims. I think that's not really it. For me, it is the question of power. In any employment relationship, there is a power dynamic, and that power is wielded by no other than the employer.
Yeah.
It's not a domestic worker in your house that has power over you. So that you have to unpack that power. And I think really when we talk about the vulnerabilities of domestic workers, we are looking at it from a power dynamic perspective. Yeah.
And Ruth, what do you say to that?
Being a community organizer, I've never come across an employer who has told me that he has been assaulted or sexually molested by a domestic worker. But we have been receiving a lot of cases of assault, exploitation, rape towards these domestic workers. So when we raise this issue, it's not that tunajaribu kufanya our domestic workers wakuwe victims, but we are trying to amplify issues that are affecting this sector and the group of women. So I think we have a bias, but it is issues-based advocacy that we are doing and trying to amplify whatever is happening to women who go wash in Italy and some suburb estate in this country.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed, this cannot really be wished away. This is not something that we can even sweep under the carpet. It happens. It does happen.
Yes.
But don't you see and as we come to the conclusion of this conversation, isn't there then space for formalized organizations or companies like the one Teresa is running that would come in as the intermediaries for that?
I think,
because now you're not going as the individual mamafua to look for employment in this company. The employer feels that they are responsible because they have engaged a company and there's a formal contract.
And then you as an individual, you're placed.
Ruth, do you want to go?
Okay, maybe Eric, I can speak a bit.
Yep.
I think as when an employee has a company that has outsourced them to a client, they feel more empowered, because when they face those like sexual harassment, they have a place to report to. And obviously, as a company, we will pick it up and be able to follow up with that employer. So we are not only looking at the issues of money and all that. We are also looking at issues of their work environment, because there is a work environment we agree with our clients that our staff has to work on. So them wholly. But you see what I was saying when it comes to issues of victims, is that when we post our staff, we post them from the position of power.
Okay.
That you are going in that home to provide a service. You are not going there as a servant. You are going to provide a service. Your service is important. So you make them go there feeling that I'm not here as a victim. I'm here to provide a service. And if the environment doesn't work, I have a place to report back.
Yeah.
And obviously we'll pick it up and be able to discuss with our clients. Our staff feels this, and this, and this. At the same time, if an employer feels that they are not being respected, will also pick it up because it is both ways. Because even in our normal office environment, the same happens. Issues of sexual harassment is not only in the home space.
Yeah.
These things happen in all the office.
But there's
in
a
all
HR
the
manager that you can report to, or a manager that you can go to.
Exactly. So as we function as that person you can come to, and you'll be able to speak about it and be able to confront that client or that employer that you may not be able to speak to.
True. Ladies, I want to thank you very much for speaking to us this morning. Unfortunately, 1 hour is a very short time to discuss such weighty matters. We'll invite you again so we can have a phase 2 of this conversation. Asanteni sana, Ruth Mombi, domestic workers activist, Mary Kambo, program manager at the Kenya Human Rights Commission, and Triza Kimani from the Nani Employee Leasing Company. Asanteni sana for joining us this morning and for your contributions.
Thank you for having us. Thank you very much.
Asanteni sana. This is the Situation Room. It's Kenya's biggest conversation.